Great. Good morning, everybody. They're still waiting for just a couple of people to join, but we'll make a start, given it's now after 10 o'clock. So good morning and welcome along to this final Fraser of Allander webinar for 2020. My name is Graeme Roy and I'm Director of the Fraser of Allander. And today we'll be talking about our final commentary, which we've published this morning in partnership with our good friends at Deloitte. Now, shortly you'll be hearing from the team on the report, but I'm also delighted that joining us today to be part of the discussion are two highly distinguished speakers. Stephen Boyle is Scotland's Auditor General, which makes him Leader of Audit Scotland and Scotland's Chief Public Auditor. And it's great to have Stephen along today, particularly given the discussion that we'll have around the outlook for the Scottish budget. And we're also delighted to be joined by Douglas Farish, who leads the Glasgow tax practice for Deloitte and is also senior partner in the Glasgow office. And it'll be great to have Douglas's reflections on what he's picking up from his daily work with the business community in Scotland, their reflections on how the outlook is tracking, but also to talk a bit about the outlook for tax policy, both in Scotland and the UK, as we look forward. So the format of today's event is that we'll hear from Mairi Spowage and David Eiser from the Institute, who will talk about today's report, and they'll talk for about 10 to 15 minutes each. And then we'll hear from Stephen and Douglas before opening it up for questions. Now, to ask your question, if you could click on the Q&A button, you can type in what it is you want to ask. Feel free to type in the question as you listen to the presentations, but I'll remind you of how you can ask your question when we come to the Q&A part. Our aim is to wrap this all up by 11:30. So we've got a lot to get through. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Mairi Spowage, who will talk us through the outlook for the Scottish economy.
Thanks, Graeme. So I'm just going to share some slides as I talk through this, just to talk about the key things that we've discussed in the commentary. What I'm going to do is I'll set out the kind of economic context, and then I'll hand over to my colleague David to talk about what this might mean for the Scottish Government's budget at the end of January. So firstly, it's good to reflect on where are we now. The economic data has obviously been fairly volatile over the course of the pandemic, and it's good to remind ourselves the pathway we've been on in terms of growth and the experience, particularly of different sectors in the economy. Of course, we all know that after cases were brought under control through severe restrictions in the lockdown during April and May, we had some easing of restrictions, which did lead to a bounce back in economic growth during the summer. But further restrictions, given the increase in cases, have been introduced during the autumn. And we're now obviously in our tiered system of restrictions from November onwards. So what we can see in this chart is the overall GDP data for Scotland up to September, which is the latest data that's available. And what we can see is the output still, whilst it bounced back, is still around 8% below pre-pandemic levels. However, overall, it's likely that Q4, so October to December, is going to be pretty sluggish given the restrictions that have been introduced. And I'll talk about some evidence we have for that in a second. But one of the key things you can see from this chart is that the sector that was affected most, so that's accommodation and food services, was severely impacted in the lockdown during April and May, as we would have expected, given the shutdown of the various premises. But they are showing a contraction again in September as restrictions were introduced, particularly in West Central Scotland at that point, but across Scotland in October. So in terms of the immediate outlook, there's a number of faster indicators that we use to kind of try and track what's happening past the point at which we have the official economic data. And for example, this data is from the Business Impacts of Coronavirus survey, which helps us track the sort of level of openness of different industries in Scotland. And what we can see is that as the increased restrictions were introduced, those businesses in accommodation and food services saw further closures over October and November. Now, this is temporary closures at the moment, so these are staff that have likely been furloughed until things get better. But it does show that this is the sector that's been most vulnerable to the introduction of new restrictions. Interestingly, whilst sectors like construction, for example, were shut down severely also during April and May, with around 40% of output being, around a 40% contraction in output in the construction sector during those months. This sector has been able to adapt to the restrictions for the most part and has continued to operate throughout these further levels of restrictions in the autumn. So we're not seeing the same contraction in sectors like construction and manufacturing that we saw during the first lockdown, as they've been able to adapt. They're not 100%, but they're almost there. So these sectors have really been able to adapt the practices so they're able to operate in a COVID safe manner during these restrictions. But it's really hospitality and arts and recreation that are feeling the pain during these new restrictions we've seen in the autumn. So you'll have heard a lot in the media today about our views on the outlook for the next few years and what we think the pathway for growth might be in the future. So our scenarios for growth, we've presented an optimistic scenario, what we consider to be a central scenario, and then a more pessimistic scenario. And these are all more optimistic than they were in the last commentary in September. Now, as we've said, there is some reason for hope. There is this light at the end of the tunnel. We know the vaccination programs have started. So at least it feels like there's a well-informed timeline for when things might get back to normal for us. And really our different scenarios are considering the different pathways for the different sectors that have been impacted by restrictions and how quickly they may recover in the spring and summer of next year. So when they might get back to more normal levels of output. So it's worth remembering, though, that even in the central scenario that we have now, it still has us returning to pre-pandemic levels of output in August 2022, which is still almost 2 years away, even if it's not quite as far out as we had it before. The more optimistic scenario sees us returning to pre-pandemic levels of output in early 2022. So that's still over a year away in terms of getting back to those pre-pandemic levels of output. So obviously, just before I hand over to David, I'll just sort of touch on, the other question we're getting asked a lot right now is what is the impact of the UK leaving the transition period at the end of December? How will things be different on the 1st of January for Scottish businesses who trade with the EU? And in the commentary today, we've provided an updated analysis of how much economic activity in different sectors is dependent on EU exports. That does not mean that economic activity will disappear or anything like that, but what it shows is the vulnerability of different sectors as if there is disruption to trade with the EU. And interestingly, our analysis has shown that we can see that many of the sectors that were most severely affected by the pandemic are the kind of least vulnerable in this situation. That doesn't hold true for all, particularly on if you look at metals, machinery and equipment manufacture or transportation and storage, they're exposed in both in both scenarios, unfortunately. But given our exports to the EU are dominated by manufactured goods, it's those sorts of sectors which will be most concerned about the introduction of customs restrictions, which we know will happen, but also potentially the introduction of tariffs if there isn't a trade deal that's done with the EU. So if you're interested in that, there's a lot more detail in the commentary about our analysis of how the pandemic risks and those of Brexit have kind of interacted with each other and how they might impact on different sectors. And then also crucially, we've looked at how that might affect different regions of Scotland. So just to kind of sum up, we do have sort of tentative optimism for the year ahead, but it will still feel like we're in a recession for some time to come. We know that unemployment is likely to rise as the furlough scheme comes to an end. We know that the official unemployment data, which was published today, kind of masks what's probably going to come as that scheme does come to an end. And whilst we're looking ahead to the next year with that optimism, there's a lot of businesses that still have to struggle through the winter, and won't be able to operate at anything like full capacity. So it might be that we'll see some businesses sort of not survive to enjoy this economic recovery. The scenarios we present set out a range of possible pathways for growth, but there's still a large amount of uncertainty with these, which is why we think that a number of scenarios are more helpful than just a point estimate forecast. Obviously, we're all looking forward to seeing our families at Christmas, although obviously there's been a lot of caution in recent days from politicians trying to get us to think carefully about that, because it may well require further restrictions in January to get the virus back under control until the large-scale vaccination can happen. And of course, we can't forget about the end of the EU transition period, which will end by the 1st of January 2021, which may lead to disruption for many of these firms that have weathered the COVID crisis. And all of this sets the context for the Scottish Government to deliver their budget at the end of January. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague, David Eiser, who's going to discuss what all this might mean for the Scottish Government budget.
Thanks, Mairi, and good morning, everyone. So yes, I'm going to think about some of the implications of all this for the upcoming Scottish budget. Recent news on vaccine development has, of course, raised expectations that 2021-22 will mark the beginnings of a recovery, both from the health and the economic shocks caused by COVID in 2020. But the precise path of that recovery, as Mairi's indicated, remains very uncertain. There's certainly some grounds for optimism. If vaccines are rolled out rapidly and are as effective as hoped, then perhaps governments will be in a position to lift most restrictions by early on in the 2021-22 financial year. And this could in turn herald a consumer-led recovery driven by an unwinding of the significant increase in household saving during 2020. But equally, there are grounds for pessimism. The vaccine rollout is clearly going to entail a massive logistical effort, and it maybe will take longer than hoped to suppress the virus to levels that are consistent with complete lifting of health restrictions. And even once restrictions are lifted, it will take time for the economy to adjust to whatever permanent structural changes have been wrought by COVID. So what's the implication of all of that for budgets? Well, I think the implication of all of this uncertainty for budgets and for fiscal policy is that budgets are going to have to be flexible and take an adaptive approach to supporting the health and economic recovery in 2021-22. And the Scottish Government's budget for 2021-22 is going to be published on the 28th of January. So what's the outlook for the Scottish Block Grant? The answer to that question was provided in the UK Government Spending Review, which was published on the 25th of November. And from a Scottish perspective, there were really two big questions that we were looking to the review to give an answer on. The first of those was what's the outlook for the Scottish Government's core block grant to cover normal devolved public services in 21-22 compared to last year. And then the second big question was how much of the additional funding to mitigate the effects of COVID during this financial year will persist into next financial year, into 21-22. So if I take that second question first, what the UK Government Spending Review in November implies is that the Scottish budget will receive £1.3 billion of funding to address the health and economic implications of COVID in 2021-22. That sounds a lot, but it's a lot lower than the 8.2 billion received this financial year. And it implies that the vast majority of the Scottish Government's COVID spending in 2021, this financial year, will not persist into 2021-22. So how realistic is that assumption? Well, effectively, it's a judgment that assumes that most, if not all, of the health restrictions will be able to be lifted in the very early part of the 21-22 financial year. And therefore that COVID spending, temporary COVID spending, will focus largely on the health issues around vaccination programs and test and trace programs, but that actually we won't need to spend very much on ongoing business support or to offset revenue loss among public sector organisations, and we won't need to spend very much providing additional support for vulnerable households or groups. And I think you could argue that those assumptions do feel on the optimistic side, and in fact, that point is kind of recognised in the spending review document itself, which sets aside an unallocated reserve of £21 billion, which the UK government can draw on as and when required during 21-22 for additional temporary COVID funding. So probably, I think, in that perspective, the Scottish Government's 1.3 billion of COVID-related allocations for next year, we can think of as a lower bound. And if the UK government, or when the UK government does end up allocating additional funding for COVID activities, that will generate additional consequentials for the Scottish budget at that point. That's not necessarily very helpful for the Scottish Government, which of course has to set out its budget plans at the end of January based on the current allocations. So you can take a specific example of what this means, what sort of difficulties this creates for the Scottish Government if you think about business rates. The UK spending review works on the assumption that business rates reliefs for businesses in tourism and hospitality sectors in England will cease completely from the start of next financial year, from April next year. And as such, it's going to be difficult for the Scottish Government to plan to fundamentally different policy on business rates relief at the current time. But the UK government spending review also notes that the UK government is basically keeping its options open on the question of business rates and business rates relief. And a change in the UK government's policy, for example, to make rates reliefs available in England for longer, would deliver substantial additional resources to the Scottish budget. But the question is, when is the UK government going to make those sorts of decisions, and will the Scottish government therefore be able to factor them into its plans when it publishes its budget? Or are we going to have another year a bit like this year, where there's a sort of very much an iterative process that goes on, whereby policy adapts to new funding that comes as a result of UK government policy changes in England? So this is an example of where the UK government is taking a flexible approach itself, which is entirely reasonable, but that flexibility does create some uncertainty for the Scottish government, and the Scottish government has limited scope to flex its budget plans. And so I think, therefore, the sort of argument and debate that started this year about whether the Scottish government should have greater funding certainty or needs additional fiscal flexibilities will continue and needs to be given some serious consideration. So what about normal public services? Well, the UK government spending review shows that Scotland's core resource block grant will increase by 1.2 billion next year, which implies an average annual real terms increase of about 3.8% per year between 1920 and 21-22. And as a result, the Scottish Government's block grant for core resource spending in 21-22 is going to exceed for the first time the previous real terms high of 2010. So we're back to the sort of pre-austerity real terms high. However, that's not quite the same as saying that the Scottish Government's spending power will be back to 2010 levels, because in the interim period, the Scottish Government has gained some new responsibilities, and the Scottish population has actually grown by more than 200,000. Now, of course, this block grant isn't the only thing that influences the level of resources that the Scottish Government will have at its disposal. Revenues from devolved taxes, additions to the block grant to reflect new social security powers, reconciliations to reflect past forecast errors, and use of the reserve are all things that influence the size of the budget at the margin. And our report discusses those issues in some depth, but I think the basic conclusion is that while there are both upside and downside risks on all of those factors, at the moment there's no strong reason to think that those factors will materially influence the growth of the resource budget between this financial year and next financial year over and above the outlook for the resource block grant itself. So it doesn't really change the conclusion that you're sort of talking of a 3.8% real terms increase, although it does introduce some further uncertainty, and it means that that final increase could be a bit more or a bit less than that. So what does this mean for government spending choices? Well, on the one hand, the government's got to decide how to prioritise its temporary but much diminished COVID funding. So clearly big questions and challenges there over how much to allocate to business or to support vulnerable groups or to invest in employability and skills programs as part of the recovery effort and balance that against needs of the NHS. And then alongside that, we've got all of the normal times issues of resource allocation. And in fact, as is often the case, if we assume that the Scottish Government will pass on health-related consequentials to the NHS in Scotland, the settlements for some other portfolios won't necessarily look particularly generous. Big decisions too on public sector pay, where the Scottish Government will need to decide to what extent it can justify going beyond the pay freeze that the UK government has applied to most public sector workers outside the NHS. What about tax? As ever, Scottish Government will face some difficult choices here. I think on income tax, Scottish Government should probably be wary of calls that cutting income tax is the best way to support the recovery. The Scottish Government does have to run a balanced budget, so a cut in income tax, whilst it might boost private incomes and spending, would also cut government spending by proportionately more, given that some of the impact of an increase in private income as a result of a tax cut would be to increase private savings rather than private consumption. So if you want to argue strongly that a balanced budget tax cut will stimulate the economy, you have to be making some fairly bold assumptions, I think, about what the supply side impacts of those tax cuts would be on individuals' behaviour and businesses. Tax cuts maybe not necessarily the answer, but of course tax increase is not necessarily the answer either, and difficult at the best of times, especially during a pandemic when tax rates in Scotland are already higher than they are south of the border, and of course there's an election coming up. One other tax just to touch on in this presentation is council tax. Council tax is interesting because there has been really significant divergence between Scotland, Wales and England in recent years. The council tax freeze lasted much longer in Scotland than in England, and certainly than in Wales, where the freeze lasted only a year. And as a result, as you can see from the chart, there's really quite substantial differences now in average Band D council tax. So you might think, well, one thing the government might want to look at is closing some of that gap. But of course, decisions on council tax always feel really unsatisfactory. Freezing the tax or not increasing it by very much does deprive local authorities of much needed revenue. But tax increases are invariably unfair because the tax is really poorly related to property value, and it's regressive with respect to income. So, these sorts of decisions leave the government stuck behind a rock and a hard place, or between a rock and a hard place, I should say. Further rise in council tax probably feels inevitable this year, given that in England, local authorities are able to increase by up to 5% this year. And that a similar rise in Scotland would raise about £110 million. As a mechanism for raising revenue for public spending, it's hard to avoid a conclusion that income tax rises might be objectively fairer, although politically probably more difficult. Touch quickly on capital spending then. The Scottish Government's block grant for capital spending is on track to increase slightly in 21-22, according to the spending review plans. But coming on the back of a couple of years of fairly good increases, the capital block grant is also back to its kind of pre-austerity real terms level. And I think there is reason to believe that there might be further capital consequentials coming to the Scottish budget for 21-22 in due course. And that's because in the spending review, the UK government did set out plans for a levelling up fund to support investment in local infrastructure and economic recovery. But those plans haven't yet been translated formally into allocated or profiled funding. So I think there probably will be some additional consequentials to come on the capital side. And the government will probably choose to add to those through capital borrowing, which it has some scope to do. So this is a sort of quick canter through some of the issues facing the Scottish budget next year. Clearly, we all hope that 21-22 is going to herald the start of a recovery from the health and economic impacts of COVID. But the path of that recovery does remain very uncertain, and budgets as a result are going to have to be flexible in the amount of support and the type of support that they provide. The Scottish Government's ability to be flexible is somewhat limited. Its budget is tied to UK government policy decisions for England, and that will continue to be a source of some friction. And there's scope for friction and tension in other areas too. For example, plans for the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which is the successor to EU structural funds, and not to mention, of course, the ongoing, well, we can probably use the word debacle of the UK's trade negotiations with the EU. And all of those frictions are going to be augmented by the proximity of the Holyrood elections in May. So that all of that tension and that uncertainty forms the backdrop to what's going to be a very challenging budget for the Scottish Government to deliver in basically 6 weeks' time. And I will hand back to Graeme.
Great. Thank you very much, David. So if I could open it up to Douglas and Stephen to get your initial reflections on that, and maybe particularly in turning to Stephen first of all. I think the story there from David is lots of change happening, unprecedented change happening to the Scottish budget within a year on a scale we've never seen before. I guess that makes your job in Audit Scotland, shall we say, interesting?
Thanks, Graeme. Yeah, good morning, everybody. Really delighted to be with you. Many thanks for inviting me. I recognise much of what's been described by Mairi and David through our own work as well. It's incredibly interesting. You talk about unprecedented, Graeme. You know, we probably overuse that phrase, but it's true in terms of our lifetime. We've never seen anything like this. From our own work, we see much of what's been described through the presentation, and particularly recognise a number of points about ultimately about choices for government, about how they choose to emerge post-COVID. Particularly struck about the scale of difference in terms of the size of the Scottish budget as a consequence of the drop from over 8 billion to around 1 billion as predicted. And that inevitably will be for government to decide how they will choose to allocate that in future. Government are thinking in those terms as we, through our own conversations, we end up, they're looking at what this means for public services in the future. And I think ultimately that's where they'll have to get to with the pace of recovery that's set out and what that means and for the duration of the decade, really. Flexibility, as far as quite struck by David's comment about flexibility on the one hand from the UK government is reasonable, but it has a direct bearing on how the Scottish government and its ability to manage its budget. We saw that, I think, earlier this year through the summer budget revision and the scale of iteration of the budget too. By indication, maybe not quite as much next year, and a degree of more stability, I think, will be welcome. I think from our perspective, one of the things that you'll know from conversations that we've had with Audit Scotland and with Caroline, my predecessor, is the driving for the transparency around some of the budget choices. In particular, I think quite reasonably, the government paused the medium-term financial strategy earlier this year, just with at the height of the pandemic, and a signal that it's planning to do so alongside the budget in January. That feels really, really important now, and that also grasps the opportunity that whilst it's difficult to predict with any degree of accuracy, it's a real essential component of kind of supporting parliamentary scrutiny, public understanding of the choices that will be made. And I think the last thing from our perspective is that regardless of how the budget is sliced, is that it's clear and it's tangible at the right point for what's been delivered from this amount of public spending, that users of public services, public bodies can clearly communicate what they've achieved from it, that it goes beyond just the reporting of the amounts that have been spent or the outputs, but actually gets clarity in terms of outcomes for users. So, but you're quite right, an incredible level of volatility. But even within the level of volatility, that there's a real role for government to provide further clarity as we move on. So really grateful for the presentation. Happy to say any more as you wish.
Excellent. There's a few things there, Stephen, that we'll pick up on, I'm sure, in the Q&A and come back to you now. But thanks very much for those reflections. Douglas, if I could turn to you just on your day-to-day work with the business community in Scotland. It'd be really interesting to get your reflections on where they are at the moment, and how optimistic, how pessimistic they are about the future outlook.
Morning, Graeme. Morning, everyone, and thanks for having me along as well. I mean, it's just, as we've said before, unprecedented times, and as one of the older folks in my organisation, I often thought I had seen it all in terms of downturns and recoveries, and I often have said, whether rightly or wrongly, that Scotland's slower in and slower out, but actually when you get the financial crisis and the pandemic, it does not operate like the start of any other crisis that we've seen before, and therefore I do worry about the slow out point. I know some of business is worried about that, and we do a CFO survey which is a wee bit outdated compared to your own work here, but that suggests the rest of the UK were ambitious of an earlier recovery than the scenarios you're showing. Equally, probably the spectre of Brexit was still slightly lower only a couple of months ago than it is now, when on the the 15th we're still uncertain of what lies right in front of us. But in terms of business, I mean, you won't be surprised to hear I've got the full spectrum of outturns from those businesses at the sort of sharp end of the downturn, the inability to basically get customers through the door. So the retail, hospitality side of things, travel, through to manufacturing, which despite blips, as you've identified yourself, are definitely back on in a COVID secure way, and markets probably surprisingly buoyant for many of them. A split food and drink sector, those making sort of long-term shelf safe products, doing really well. Those supplying that hospitality and tourism business, struggling, and those that are worrying about Brexit. Financial services doing well, and we're seeing obviously growth from people bringing some of their headcount up from down south still into Scotland, which is great to see. So a real mix across business, and therefore I think what we need to see is something that helps repair the damage for those that can be supported and need that support most, through to something that encourages the growth, the new entrepreneurs, the new businesses.
Yeah, and we've not really yet had a discussion yet, have we, about the policy agenda for the recovery? We've spoken a lot, but the government's thrown the kitchen sink at just protecting us through the crisis. I guess it's what next. And with that in mind, what's your reflections on the outlook for tax policy? Either in a Scottish context or a UK context. And I know you won't want to get into the specifics, but in terms of the general trends, what's your expectation about where things might go?
Very difficult. I think David mentioned 2 or 3 times. It's difficult to say, but I guess some observations. And I don't envy Kate at all. I think she really has her work cut out to go first this January, and I hope the fact that this is again such an unusual time, we're forgiving of her to the extent that she's in uncharted territory. But she's limited fiscal levers in terms of the tax side of things. So there's obviously spend and cost control to be dealt with as well. And we have seen mistakes where taxes have gone up and takes gone down, such as the land and buildings tax. So that's your Laffer curve effect. And therefore, if we can walk a path which encourages something to build on business, help the most disadvantaged, but certainly encourage investment, then that's the path I want to see. And I think if you narrow it down to corporate income tax, we all were worrying pre-pandemic about a race to the bottom in terms of a reduction in corporate tax rates. I think internationally we're going to see, all the treasuries across the world trying to get their fair share of tax to repair the deficits that have been built up. And they might not increase rates, but I think behaviour, collection, transfer pricing as to what the fair share is going to be a fight that we will have to play our part in. And what worries me is, quite rightly, the OECD have focused on base erosion and profit shifting to remove unfair tax advantages, but we have seen creeping in again before pandemic, and I think we're going to see a lot more of this double taxation, where those international businesses aren't getting relief in another territory, but they're getting taxed back here. And the OECD, I think, need to move to ward against that. We can't have that. And then another area which I think concerns me is the mobility of people. I'm very optimistic when I looked at all those views that Scotland would see massive headcount increases. Edinburgh in particular, we're looking at continuing great growth in headcount pre-COVID. And how does that work post-COVID? Actually, do people look at it and say, well, it was easier to work remotely than I had ever thought, therefore I will go to where I want to be in Scotland and have a better quality of life living in Scotland? Both rest of the UK, returning Scots and foreign nationals. That would be a great way to increase the base if we can make that come true looking more further forward. So tax has to encourage. I see we do have a question on whether short-term wealth tax, and maybe I could just take that now. Again, I could see why that would bring in a reasonable amount of income in the short term, but what if the possibility was of bringing good workers, entrepreneurs, business leaders up from elsewhere, and that were to discourage that from happening? That would be very counterproductive. So again, I think it's a path that needs walked, and we need to make sure, and again, pick up David's points, there needs to be some dynamism to the policy for the twists and turns ahead. Yeah,
it's really interesting points. And David, I've maybe come to you, but if I can just say, we'll now turn to the Q&A section. So if people would like to put some questions into the Q&A, and please given that I'm chairing, please make them really difficult, and I'll pass them on. But just coming to David, first of all, so you've actually just written a paper on the devolution of wealth taxes, the possibility of whether taxes and wealth could be devolved. Perhaps maybe you could answer that question, but also just explain a wee bit about some of the wider reflections you had about the challenges and opportunities of trying to set a wealth tax at a devolved level.
Yes, okay. Wealth taxes. So, well, if we take the UK sort of question first, I think that the question is probably referring to a report of the UK Wealth Tax Commission, which came out, I think, last week, and which recommended this one-off wealth tax at a UK level. I think there's certainly a case for saying that in the UK, wealth is a tax base that is, well, you could say it's undertaxed. It's certainly that we certainly have a sort of bit of a mishmash of ways of trying to tax wealth, sort of capital gains tax, which then has lots of reliefs and exceptions to it, and inheritance tax, which most people don't need to pay, and in fact, people who have lots of wealth tend to be able to find ways of avoiding it quite effectively. Some people also mention council tax as a wealth tax, but I would kind of question whether that's really anything of the sort. So there's been a long-standing case for saying that we could tax wealth better, perhaps more, certainly more efficiently and effectively. There are sort of two big questions, I suppose. One is, should we have a new wealth tax, which is a sort of like a tax on the total wealth that all individuals or households have, or should we try and reform the existing system of wealth taxes that we have? Should we try and reform capital gains tax and inheritance tax so that they look a bit more sensible and work a bit more sensibly? That's one question, and the report of the Wealth Tax Commission certainly was in favour of a new net wealth tax rather than reforming the existing ones. And then the second question is, should that tax be a one-off tax or a sort of ongoing annual tax? And the Wealth Tax Commission on that question said their recommendation was that the tax should be a one-off, and that was largely because actually it'd be really, really difficult to do things like value your wealth, and so to do that every year would be a huge burden. But the argument is that, well, if you did it, you could do it once, and it wouldn't be such a burden, and could help public finances at this particular time. There's another big equity problem, I suppose, with having a one-off tax, and that's that it doesn't really get at the issue that wealth changes a lot over our lifetimes. And if you have a one-off wealth tax, it's kind of hitting a particular demographic at one point in time, which is, well, you could say there's a case for that on equity grounds, given that there's a demographic that's generally done pretty well in relation to wealth. So that's the UK questions. I should say that there's on the website of the Wealth Tax Commission, there are at least a dozen papers that look at various aspects of wealth tax. And I was asked to write one on, if you had a wealth tax, would it be a good tax to devolve? I should say I was not involved in any way in the final report. So the recommendations I've just been talking about, I was just asked to sort of think about the question of, if the UK did have a wealth tax, should it be devolved? And there are lots of factors that are worthy of consideration if you're thinking about whether a tax should be devolved. Things like how visible that tax would be to people in the devolved territory, how many people in the devolved territory would pay it, how easy it would be to administer at a devolved level, how easy it would be to have different rates or bands or something at the devolved level, and how easy it might be for people in the devolved territory to avoid it by moving elsewhere or changing their stated location elsewhere. But one other factor, of course, is whether it is a recurring or a one-off tax. And I think if it's a one-off tax, that that almost certainly kind of tips the balance away from the argument that it could be devolved. The additional administration issues, you might consider if this was going to be an annual tax, but I think if you're talking about a one-off wealth tax, the additional hurdles you'd have to go through to make sure it worked at a devolved level would probably not be worth it for the benefits that you would get. There would be big questions, for one thing, around the fact that average wealth is lower in Scotland than in the UK as a whole, and so the Scottish government might actually not do as well from having this at a devolved level as it would if it was at a UK level with funds allocated in the usual way. And if you had the tax on an annual basis, there are ways you can get around that or do the allocations a bit differently. But if it's one-off, it's very difficult to see how you get around those issues.
Great, thanks, David. And so there's 12 papers on wealth tax. There's everyone's Christmas holiday reading sorted. But there is actually some really interesting stuff that they've said on the wealth tax report. So it's worth looking in David's paper on tax devolution, on wealth devolution is really interesting because it gets into broader questions about what might happen around what taxes to devolve potentially in the future too. So maybe if I could turn to Stephen around budget transparency. So you mentioned transparency in the budget and the challenges, particularly this year, in coping with the unprecedented changes that have come in within year. What's your reflections on what progress has been made in budget transparency in Scotland over the last few years? And where do you think there's still quite a lot of progress that could be made? What areas do you think that we could do better?
Thanks, Graeme, and thanks for the question. You're right. I think this year in particular, I do have some sympathy with the pace of announcements that have come and changed to the Scottish budget. I think at most recent count, if we're not over 100 yet of changes in the year, then we can't be far off that. It kind of captured all the way through just the scale of the 8 billion. We've publicly stated, we welcomed the summer budget revision. Thought that was an appropriate thing to do in terms of increasing transparency alongside the usual autumn and spring budget revision. Whether we'll see another summer budget revision next year, I guess, remains to be seen. I think government has been under a bit of pressure. I think we've seen, like it's alluded to in the question, about the rate with which it is sharing the changes to its budget, and it is tackling the accusation that there is a big pot sitting there that isn't being passed on to public bodies or people that it was designed for. So I think it was a kind of helpful contribution from the Cabinet Secretary last week about kind of restating publicly what is available, and etc. From our perspective, we've undoubtedly seen the volatility with the budget this year and in previous years. Through our own work, I think we've kind of sought to kind of gather up that. We produced a paper back in August, and we'll produce an update to that in February that sets out some of the kind of spending flow through and how that's changed the budget. Much of it, I guess, comes back to kind of David's point about the flexibility with which one government kind of rightly wants relative to its impact on others. And key to that is, I guess, the communication between the two governments that then flows through transparency to users of public services. And go back to the kind of central point, essentially, that the role of the medium-term financial strategy is really a key part of kind of users of public services, the public at large, kind of understanding, because the options and the scenarios and fleshing that out further. So really looking, a lot of emphasis on what might be shared in January. And beyond, I think it's inevitable that the mechanisms and the processes that existed pre-COVID and pre-pandemic, I think there's rightly reflection on whether they're still fit for how people and the appetite they want for regular updates. And lastly, I'd say you can see the expectations that have changed, in public and parliamentarians, that there's just an enormous thirst for regular updates, perhaps driven by, say, the kind of the daily briefings and so forth. but that then flows through to what this means for spending and choices into the future. And I think that's probably unavoidable. So it's perhaps some reflections there as to whether the mechanisms that have existed in years gone by are still going to satisfy just the huge need and expectation that exists.
So if I could just pick up on a bit more detail around that, Stephen. So one of the things that we hear about year on year in the budget is there's always a priority around the budget, whether it be productivity, regional growth, innovation, infrastructure. There's always a kind of headline. But the one theme that goes through all budgets, irrespective of administration, is how the budget can be used to tackle inequalities. And I know you won't want to get into any specifics around policies around how best to tackle inequalities, but do you think that we do enough in understanding how the budget works and the various components of the budget and the various interactions around what we can and can't do in Scotland to do more to tackle inequalities?
It's a really interesting question. It's usually topical, Graeme. I think particularly having seen, through the pandemic, how unequal it has been to various parts of society. We are fans of the National Performance Framework, which sets out the Government of Scotland's ambition as to kind of what it wants to achieve. Where we think there's more to do, though, is to better translate both the budget and public spending and what's been delivered through the National Performance Framework. I think very soon we're due to see the government's, if any day now, the update to Scotland's wellbeing, which kind of will set out how well as a country, again reasonably delayed given the pressures from the pandemic. But fundamentally I agree. I think there is more scope to set out the impact of public spending, how it's tackling inequalities, policy areas in the round, so that people can better understand it's not just public body X that spent this money, but actually go beyond organisational boundaries more clearly to say what's actually being delivered for the public borrowing, public taxes that we all pay.
David, and that's a theme that you've talked a bit about in the past around the whole idea about wellbeing budgets, inclusive growth budgets. What's the targets that are trying to achieve? Have you got any reflections on what we've seen over the last few years in terms of being a bit easier to capture about how all the various components of spend are impacting on things like inequalities, or have we still got quite a long way to go?
I think it's obviously an important question, but it's a difficult one to answer. I mean, the outcomes that the government is hoping for when it sets its budgets are very broad and all-encompassing, and it's not necessarily at all easy to identify either when you set a budget or sort of later on when that spending has been made, what the impacts might be or what the impacts have been when there are so many things that impact particular outcomes, like inequality, if you wanted to take one example. Having said that, there are some sorts of policies where if you take an outcome like income inequality, we can measure income inequality, and we should be able to estimate in a broad sense how some sorts of initiatives would impact on that outcome. And there's probably still some scope there, I think, to get a bit better, both at a budget event and subsequently when we come to sort of evaluate these things, trying to pin down or quantify in more detail what the impacts of spend on that outcome are likely to be. I mean, some outcomes it's even harder to do that, but certainly income inequality, if you take that as an example, there are ways of measuring that, and there are ways of estimating how certain sorts of policies might impact on that as an outcome.
Yeah, so I think this is lots in there to see, and I think it'll be really interesting how the government approach setting out the objectives of the budget when they come in January, given all the challenges that exist. But what is this saying about well-being, inclusive growth, and the type of economy that we want to build? It wouldn't be a webinar without a chat about Brexit, and I was just checking there to see whether any movement had been made, but we're still talking. Who would have thought that negotiating a trade deal would be quite difficult? So maybe if I could come to Mairi, first of all, if you could just give us an update on where we are at the moment in terms of the negotiations, the different options on the table. So we've obviously had different names of countries over the last couple of years, whether it be a Canadian deal, a Swiss deal, a Norway deal, and the new one seems to be an Australia deal. So perhaps maybe you could tell us a bit about what that would look like, and what a no deal would look like, and the various potential implications for the Scottish economy.
Sure. Well, as far as I can tell, the Australia deal and the no deal are essentially the same thing. Although anyone can correct me if they've got any more information on that. But essentially, it would mean that we don't have a free trade agreement in place with the EU, and therefore we would become a third country under the World Trade Organization rules, and that would mean there would be tariffs that would be paid. If we were sending our goods to the EU, they would be paid by businesses or individuals in the EU. And similarly with goods and services, goods coming back into the UK. So I guess one thing to point out, the point has been made quite a lot of times by different organisations, is that things are going to change on the 1st of January, whether or not a deal is done. There are going to have to be customs declarations and other things filled in, which businesses who have only exclusively exported to the EU aren't used to. So businesses in those sectors have been preparing for that, but exactly what that will look like is still fairly uncertain. I would say is what we're hearing from businesses, and there's still a lot of uncertainty about what that might mean. For example, people who are sending goods to Northern Ireland. Particularly if we're thinking about the crossing from Stranraer to Northern Ireland and what that might mean. So in terms of practical issues for businesses, a lot of them haven't been resolved, and those will be issues whether or not there is a deal. But if there is not a trade deal, then there will also be issues around tariffs, and it might mean that particular producers or particular goods where they don't tend to sell them into the domestic market and they tend to pretty much exclusively send them to the EU, might become completely uncompetitive, because the sorts of tariffs we're talking about are pretty exorbitant on particularly on food products. So it's going to change. There is probably going to be some disruption. The UK have set out that they will, be fairly lenient on the paperwork that's required for things that are coming into the country from the EU for maybe 6 months of next year. But if there isn't a deal done, it might be less likely that the EU will feel the same in terms of being a bit more flexible about all the paperwork that's required. So really, it's still quite uncertain about how much friction those paperwork changes may cause. And if there's tariffs on top of that, that might just mean that some Scottish exporters are just uncompetitive. There's also just the general disruption that might be caused by delays, which particularly for fresh products is an issue in terms of the shellfish that we export, for example, in Scotland. If stuff doesn't get to the EU quickly, then it can't be sold. So that's a sort of just-in-time issue, which might mean that the products aren't able to be exported in the same way anymore. And there are businesses that basically that's what they do. So it would be a worry that those businesses might not be able to survive. So expecting some disruption, I think, is reasonable in January, kind of no matter what happens. But if there isn't a deal done, then the disruption from the non-tariff point of view might be greater. And then there'll be tariffs on top of that to deal with.
Thanks. And Douglas, I guess you guys have been working with businesses since 2016 and trying to get them ready for what might happen. And again, it'd be useful to get your reflections on, how prepared do you think businesses are across Scotland, and also as well, are any looking at opportunities that might come from from some changes in market structures that might be presented by actually the transition period finally ending at the end of this month.
Yeah, thanks, Graeme. And maybe just a comment to echo what Mairi was saying in terms of paperwork. We were having a conversation with a whiskey producer last week about exports, and currently you've got one page, and going forward in No Deal you're talking about many pages of forms to move now, and that's something that's not particularly vulnerable to a couple of days of extra aging, unlike the shellfish and the crabs. So as a practical matter, mistakes are going to be made, things are going to get stuck because the right papers are not there. Not all transport companies are able to take that burden, or not all producers have got the capability to deal with it yet. And there's a huge scaling up. The government website lists those organisations that can help, but there's a huge cliff edge in front. And then to the question about how prepared are people, we've certainly been saying from the early days, and for once I can say that we have been saying this with my hand on heart, is that prepare for the worst and then be pleasantly surprised. And again, here we are, really worried that the worst is right in front of us in terms of a no deal. And because it's still not resolved, that makes it hard. And yes, those organisations who dealt with it first were typically international transport, so airlines and associated freight and financial services, where they needed to have those licenses in EU territories. So we saw some early movers there. Others were those international businesses of scale who felt they could probably afford to do proper risks assessments and do that preparation. But I'm sort of stunned by the number of questions in the last 2 or 3 weeks that have come out, which suggest that there are a number of businesses, particularly the SMEs, who did not believe we would get to this position and are not unreasonably panicking. And there's just not enough days left to resolve all those issues.
Yeah, it's going to be the big challenge, isn't it? There's the questions about Brexit long term, but just getting through the next few weeks will be really interesting. And I see we're still, talks are continuing, and hope is slightly rising, I think, this morning, but we'll see by the afternoon it'll be back down again, and then it'll be back up again in the evening. So it's like it's an exciting soap opera to watch. Okay, so there's a question here around home working practices, and Douglas, you touched on this already, just around thinking about Scotland as where people might want to be based, where they want to work, and potentially reflecting a different quality of life choice than potentially they've had in the past. In thinking positively about what might happen in the future, I guess the transition to working at home is going to be something which is potentially here to stay. And are you picking up that from the businesses that you're speaking with about trends in that, and whether that's a good or a bad thing for the businesses that you're speaking with?
Yes, so it clearly divides, and we see this all the time about the number of people that do work in offices, and even within Scotland, how Edinburgh is the highest proportion compared to Glasgow, Dundee, Aberdeen, and other centres here, which means different things for different people. But in terms of those who are able to work from office, and therefore that is capable of being translated to successful home working, where many hundreds of thousands of us are working away on Zoom and email, sitting in front rooms like me. That works well. We will not see people return to the office like they did before. And what will the office become? What's the point of going into the office to simply type emails and make one-to-one phone calls? I think the use of the office for that collaboration, team working, will be much more important. There's also quite a difference for me, and it's something I'm quite passionate about, is what about those organisations that take a lot of apprentices or graduates into an office structure where, again, home working can be allowed. I don't think you can fully ingrain someone with the skills remotely yet. They need to be sort of learned by osmosis of being around. So if all the senior and experienced people stay at home and the grads come in, you lose something. So, there's going to have to be, scheduling will never be more important to make sure people with community of interests and skills and teams come in at the right time. But then the other component of it is, and again, we're seeing this with clients, they've got people who want to work, and it's not always from the UK, and that causes difficulties. So if you allow your staff to work remotely from another country, or these are people from another country that want to work remotely in Scotland, but for a country in Europe or America, what does that mean for the taxation of that business and the personal taxation of the individuals? And to get the talent right, we would want to embrace all that, but the admin and the tax around it becomes very, very difficult. But I think there's a lot to play for, and people, all the surveys we've done, people want to come in where they can do between 40 and 60% of their pre-COVID attendance.
Yeah, and we've got a project on the go at the moment around home working, and what's quite interesting is that the number of people that say actually it's been okay in terms of productivity and moving existing work to home, that's okay, but it's the new relationships, it's the new contracts, it's the integrating the new staff, it's the innovation, the workplace innovation, the interaction that take place that is actually is potentially the thing that could impact on productivity going forward. It might be really interesting just to get Stephen's reflections on all of this, given that you're a very big organisation, and I'm sure, like everybody else, you decamped home in March, and it'd be really good just to get your reflections on how Audit Scotland reported it, given that you're probably working in really sensitive areas, so you've got some particular challenges that academics like us potentially don't have to be so concerned about on a day-to-day basis.
Thanks, Graeme. Actually, I recognise much of what Douglas has described. From our own organisation, we employ about 300 people, and we're dispersed all over Scotland, offices in Edinburgh, Glasgow and Inverness. But of course, we audit public bodies all over the country, and some quite remote and rural locations too. So pre-COVID, we had large groups of people travelling all over the country typically to visit public bodies and to conduct audit work. So you're right, like everyone else, that ground to a halt in terms of our work, in terms of visiting in the middle of March. But since then, we've been carrying out audit work, not quite as normal, I wouldn't be so flippant as to say that, but we have delivered our audit work, still producing reports, still signing off sets of accounts and so forth. And I think it poses kind of longer term thinking that we, like yourselves, we've been consulting certainly with colleagues and getting feedback from our clients as to what the future might look like. And certainly from colleagues' perspective is that we think we're probably heading back to a hybrid model that will say, look, what is the office for? Why do we go there? Certainly recognise the point about creativity and innovation, that that works better in a face-to-face environment. I think whilst the technology has worked for us, it's allowed us to do what we need to. I think there's a degree of thinking needed about what the future might look and how we best vision that while we're all staring at each other on a screen. We're also big graduate and modern apprenticeship employers now as well. And I think there is a bit about, again, I hate the expression, but we use it a lot, about onboarding people, firstly, in terms of bringing new people into the organisation, doing that successfully. But there's a real kind of onus on giving people the right experience, us remaining an attractive employer. And the data security point you make is really interesting too as well. And it's been a bit of a mixed picture actually, but not in terms of the security of data, but I guess from how we as a public auditor and public bodies have accommodated each other during the past 7-8 months. I think in general terms, what we've probably seen is that those bodies that had invested in their technology pre-COVID were far better placed, whether it was through business continuity plans, ironically probably to support Brexit arrangements that were then deployed for the pandemic, were better placed to kind of produce a more straightforward audit arrangement. There's lots of thinking to do about how we carry out our work, what it means for security, productivity, creativity. All these things feel like they're up for grabs and conversations to be had.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. And I want to try and finish on a couple of questions. We try and start to look positively. So we've had a lot of sober assessments about where we are and where things are going, but where their opportunities are. And there's a question here around future investment in the green recovery and what scope there is for a country such as Scotland to take advantage of that, and the role of public sector funding in driving that recovery. So maybe if I could come to Mairi first of all around the kind of wider comment around green growth and the opportunities within that, and then open it up to the others to talk about where the funding sources could potentially be for that.
Yeah, so in terms of thinking about the sort of recovery we want to build, obviously the net zero targets are there and are not really that far away in terms of the challenge that we have to rise to. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of changing our transport infrastructure, changing the way we heat our homes, and so on. And so there is a case to be made that incentivising and encouraging the sorts of activity that will ensure that our homes can be made more green, ensuring that we can heat our homes in a way which could be compatible with net zero, and all of these other things is a way to stimulate the recovery, stimulate economic activity, but also to help us achieve those targets which we must achieve. So there is a kind of case for a win there. Also, if one thinks about looking at the sort of idea of the circular economy and the reuse of materials, and not just focusing on whether measures are making buildings more efficient or more energy efficient, but also the sorts of carbon that's embodied in the materials that are used and these sorts of things, that automatically kind of lends itself to more local supply chains being built. Because you have to focus more on reuse and transport costs and lots of other things. So that can have a larger multiplier effect in the local economy than perhaps just focusing on making buildings more energy efficient can.
And okay, so maybe coming to maybe David, and then it'd be really good to get Douglas's thoughts from a tax perspective. But the role of government in potentially trying to drive forward this investment opportunity in a devolved context, David, what scope is there for the Scottish Government to secure these longer term investments? So you mentioned the capital budget being increasing, but are there other sources that potentially could be tapped into to try and unlock the investment in the green recovery?
Good question. I mean, I think, as I say, there's a degree of uncertainty at the moment about the outlook for some capital funding and also regional economic development funding more generally, both because of uncertainties that I mentioned on things like levelling up funds and the successor to EU structural funds. Of course, what we're talking about there is sort of conventional government funding, and the Scottish Government has consistently for many years now used various other sorts of funding options to unlock investments. And of course, one of the things that's happened quite recently is the Scottish National Investment Bank has opened up to its sort of first round of funding, and that's one of the mechanisms through which over the course of the next 5 years or more, the Scottish Government hopes to effectively leverage public funding to make loans to private companies to unlock particular sorts of project that would be unviable without that funding. So that's going to be, I think, the key, certainly one of the key planks of the Scottish Government's strategy over the next over the next few years. I think we're sort of seeing less of the sort of public-private partnership funding models that we used to see. But we'll probably see more of that sort of National Investment Bank modelling over the next few years, and it'll be really interesting to see how effective that is and the outcomes of that. One of the things that came out of the spending review is that the Scottish Government's allocation of so-called financial transactions, which is the type of funding that the Scottish Government uses to capitalise the investment bank, is down quite a bit on this year, and you know, it's worth pointing out that this Scottish National Investment Bank, like all other sorts of funding in Scotland, ultimately that the resources that the Scottish Government has to put into that depend on the usual sort of Barnett formula interactions, and so ultimately on the allocations that it's getting from the UK government, as is the case for other sorts of public funding.
Great. And maybe if we can come to you, Douglas, on the tax side of things, it strikes me as being one of the areas we've not really got to really thinking through carefully is the future of the tax system in a world of a transition to net zero. And we know that we're going to have to change everyone's behaviours in quite a significant way. Again, I know you won't want to go into specifics in terms of policies, but really interesting to get your general reflections on the direction of travel around the whole way we're going to essentially change the tax system to support a transition to net zero, but actually to force us all to take the difficult and unpalatable decisions we don't want to make about our behaviours that are going to be absolutely crucial in order to cut down our own carbon emissions.
Yes, I don't want to make myself unpopular, but I'll make one personal comment, I guess, in response to that. But so we already have certain initiatives out there that you're more than familiar with, whether it's R&D tax credits, bandbox, or more pointed to this one, enhanced relief for capital investment in energy efficient kit and equipment for businesses. Personally, they're probably tinkering around the edges of what we need to do if we're going to encourage people to move wholesale, and therefore I think you're going to have to see a system that's more carrot and stick, and that's the bit that's probably unwelcome. For those that want to move, then tax carrots are great, but those that are unable to or don't want to move so quickly, then sticks are unwelcome. But I think you don't get the change of behaviour with just carrots. And again, if you took an example in Scandinavia, a couple of years ago, you go around and the streets would be a high proportion of electric vehicles, and my sort of question was, well, how can they afford these vehicles, which tend to be pretty expensive? And the answer is, well, it's actually not so much that there's a tax break associated with those vehicles, but petrol and diesel vehicles are taxed to a huge percentage compared to the UK, such that they are now materially more expensive than the electric equivalent, and that changed behaviour. So for me, there's a long journey ahead. There needs to be some real targeted stuff, but a bit of reward and a bit of penalty probably.
Great. And Stephen, from a public sector budget perspective, obviously David spoke about on the investment side of things, but I guess public spending more broadly is now going to have to look much more aggressively through a lens that supports the transition towards net zero. And again, from a budget transparency point of view, I know we have a carbon budget that comes out, it's been out for about 10 years now, but do you see more in that whole world of transparency and audit about what we're doing to use the money that we're spending as government to tackle climate change?
Yeah, I think that's all true, Graeme, actually. And I think, and interestingly, even looking at the National Performance Framework again, that there are competing priorities in there. You can think about the drive for net zero and perhaps butting up against some of the infrastructure spend against that. Like David mentions, we're also tracking the SNIB and where that goes with its ambition and so forth. But yeah, I couldn't agree more that I think particularly looking at the transparency, but I guess won't just be about of course the important need for further transparency about the investment of what's being returned for the carbon future that we're looking for, but equally thinking about kind of the skills and capacity that as a country that we have to do that. And COVID, one of the positives that may come out of it is that particularly thinking about the skills and the opportunities that we provide people to retrain and focus their efforts therein. And it's absolutely on our radar, particularly both climate and also the skills response as part of our forward programme. So work from us next year.
Great. Thank you very much, Stephen. I'm just conscious of time, and it's good Zoom etiquette to finish meetings slightly in advance of when they're due to end, because I think that's the chance that we all get to go and grab a quick cup of tea before our next Zoom session begins. So I want to just bring this webinar to a close and to thank Mairi and David for their overview and insights on the commentary published today, but also particular thanks to Stephen and Douglas for their interesting insights today. I think we've covered a lot of really important issues that I'm sure we'll be picking up in the months to come around home working, budget transparency, tax, Brexit, green recovery and equalities. So I think there's lots of things to look forward to in future discussions in 2021. And of course, we've got the small matter of May the 6th and a Scottish election, when I think all of these issues will come to the fore once again. So it just leaves me to close this seminar and to thank everybody for their ongoing support for the Fraser of Allander Institute through 2020, and particularly to the support that we get from Douglas and the team at Deloitte for the economic commentary. It's something that is exceptionally valuable to us, and we're really grateful for their support and insights and encouragement throughout the year. From behalf of the Fraser of Allander, wish you all and your family a peaceful and hopefully quiet Christmas and festive period, and the very best wishes from us all for 2021. Thank you very much for joining us, and hope to see you all soon.
Thanks, Graeme. Bye, everyone.
Thanks very much. Bye for now.